Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Audrey Rindlisbacher, author of The Mission Driven Life and working on a new book, How Truth Makes Us Free, and the founder and creator of the Mission Driven Mom and Mission Driven Teen Academies. And there's other programs and courses over at audreyrindlisbacher.com if you want to check all of that out. I'm excited to talk to you today about something that just crossed my mind recently, and I've kind of been exploring it. I want to start by telling you a few stories. I'm going to tell you some stories and talk about how those stories demonstrate what it means to be peculiar and how that happens and why that matters. And then we're going to turn to some scripture and to some word definitions to think differently about ourselves in our own modern day and what it means for us to be lovers of God. So Eric Metaxas is the famous author of Bonhoeffer and Luther and my personal favorite, Amazing Grace about William Wilberforce. He also has Socrates in the City podcast, and I've been to some of his dinners that he has with speakers, his YouTube channel, all of those things. He's an incredible guy. And he was born from Greek immigrant parents who were Greek Orthodox. And so he did grow up in the Christian faith. And then he was the first person in his family to go to college, and he was accepted to Yale because he's really brilliant. And so he was at Yale and adopting the modern worldview that believing in God is stupid, it's a fairy tale, there's no truth in it, and eventually lost his faith, was an atheist of sorts, living his life, doing his thing, and he finishes college and he's out of college and things just aren't going well. He can't find the kind of work he wants to do. He's a writer, but he just was failing at life. So he moved back home, and this was really mortifying, but it put him in contact with someone who was kind of on a Christian drip campaign, basically talking to him about God and all these things. And it's kind of a long story that has to do with his own life, his family's love of fishing and ice fishing, and his Greek background in the way that the fish was the secret code in the early church for knowing that you were a believer in Christ because he was a fisher of men. And all of these things kind of combined in his life until he got to the point where he was willing to say, God, if you're really there, then manifest yourself to me. And over time got a little bit more honest about asking God to show himself to him. So basically, he gets to this point in his life where he's willing to try to find out if there's really a God. And he has a dream one night, and it's this beautiful symbolic experience for him. He's ice fishing. He pulls a fish out of the water. It's golden. He realizes it's Christ because of all these symbols in his life. He realizes that this is true. And in his dream, he has his spiritual conversion. But what's interesting to me, the purposes of what we're talking about today, is what happened after the dream. So, in a podcast that he did with Jordan Peterson not too long ago, he ends up telling this whole story and telling about the dream. And then he says to Jordan Peterson, it changed everything. I was a different person from that day forward. My life changed very dramatically. So Jordan Peterson asks, how were you different? What changed about you? And he says, the first most immediate manifestation was that I stopped sleeping with my girlfriend of 3 years. I knew I just can't do that. That's for marriage. He said, I had such a sense of God's presence in those first few days after my conversion that I thought, I won't give up. I, I won't give that feeling up for anything. I wouldn't want to do anything to hinder God's presence in my life. That personal relationship with God, who loved me and created the universe for me and died for me, was so beautiful and extraordinary that I wouldn't do anything to screw that up. And that reminded me of Mark Twain's Joan of Arc. And I didn't pull it off the shelf, but there's a section in the book where, Joan feels called as the Maid of Lorraine, and she exercises faith, and these miracles take place for people to take her seriously, and she's finally given an army, and she knows they need to go to battle. And so they're in this camp with the army. She's working with the general, and she puts very stringent rules in place about how the men can behave, have to behave in camp if they want to be part of her army. And some of those things include coming to mass, I think like once or twice a day. They have to come to prayer and to religious services. They are not allowed to engage in any sexual acts outside of marriage. They're not there with their wives, so that's off limits. I think they're not allowed to drink. All of these kinds of things because she wants purity. She wants them to be pure. And she really believes that that purity is something that God is requesting as a sacrifice for the blessing that they want to achieve to win in war. I also know a woman who went through an experience somewhat similar to Eric Metaxas. She was involved in this service work, and for 1 week especially, it was really, really intense, and she was involved in this service work all week long, just gave of herself 100%. And when it was all done and she went back home, she felt such an intense presence of God for the next few days that she was brought to tears regularly. And it's so interesting because not very long thereafter, we were talking and she happened to mention to me that she knew that what she had to do was stop sleeping with her boyfriend. And so in each of these instances, there's this connection between feeling God's presence, feeling intensely his love, and the shedding off of certain behaviors. And what that looks like in terms of what we're talking about today is being peculiar, being different than the world around you, not just being different than you were before, being different than the accepted societal norms, raising yourself to what we would call a higher level of being, to a higher level of purity in order to facilitate the closeness with God that you're experiencing and to prolong that or to honor that or to show gratitude to that. Another really good example of this kind of experience and being peculiar in the world is Brother Andrew. Now, I don't think I've done like a book review of God's Smuggler, but I really should because it's a game changer. It is incredible. In this book, there's a young man who he came to be called Brother Andrew, and he was raised in Holland. He went off to war, left his faith behind, did all the things, came back a broken man, an alcoholic, and he's going through this reconversion experience, and he eventually gives his ego up, gives his life over to God, and wants to go do missionary work full time. And so he's able eventually to find his way to a special seminary school where he's going to learn things to be able to go and do this work. And he's out, he doesn't have any money. And so there's a couple things here in the case of being peculiar and rising to a higher level in connection with being in a closer relationship with God that he experiences. So he's living with the Hopkins family, and this is what it says about them. While I was putting away my toothbrush and razor, one of the workers told me a little about Mr. Hopkins. He was a successful contractor, yet he lived in penury. 9/10 of his income he gave away to various missions. So he's able to stay with these people because this man donates to the seminary, to the mission that he's part of right at that moment. But here's a man who's actually incredibly successful in his career, but his relationship with God and the covenant that he's made to be a son of God, to follow God, has caused him to give away 90% of what he earns. He lives in this little tiny house. They're comfortable. They have enough. And he gives away absolutely everything else. And then Brother Andrew goes through this process himself of coming into this relationship more and more with God and learning to trust him more and more. He says that he realized that when he was a factory worker, he felt financial security because he knew that when he worked, he would be paid. He says that was it. It wasn't that I needed the security of a certain amount of money in my mission work. It was that I needed the security of a relationship. And so he enters into this relationship with God, trusting him that as he goes out and does this service work, he will be provided for. That night, I knelt in front of the window and made a covenant with God. Lord, I need to know if I can trust you in practical things. And so he does this test, and God is testing him, and he is testing God. And what he finds is that he can't give away money fast enough. He says, we stuck fast to two rules. We never mentioned a need aloud, and we gave away a tithe of whatever came in as soon as we got it, within 24 hours if possible. So he says that they came back after this project, after this mission project that they'd gone on, with more money than they left with, because of this trust that he put in God, in this relationship that he had with him. And again, doing something peculiar, something different than the world does, giving money back to God, back to the needy, back to other people. And I know that through Wilberforce and other people, philanthropy has become more fashionable, tithe not so much. And so giving back to the churches, back to God, so that God's work can be done, it makes you peculiar. It makes you different than the people around you. I knew a woman who was discovering God and becoming more converted to following him. And she knew she needed to tithe, but she didn't want to. When she finally took actions of faith, she noticed an increase of God's Spirit in her life and a witness that tithe was what she needed to do. But this is again that these miracles come after the trial of our faith, that when we step into a relationship with God, he's going to ask us to be peculiar. He's going to ask us to do something that's not fashionable. It's not cool. It's not what the world around us is doing. It's going to make us stand out and be different than the people around us. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a struggle. It's going to feel like a sacrifice. But it's going to raise us to a higher level in our relationship with him and help us to stand out and bring its own incredible blessings. Another one that comes up often is the principle of modesty. There's lots of testimonials online about people, especially women, but all people who come into a closer relationship. I watched this, it's called Girls Gone Bible, and these women are models. And as they've come closer and closer to God and more in relationship with him, they've become more and more modest, and talked specifically about modesty in their language, modesty in the way they carry themselves and the kinds of things they talk about and how they tell those things, and their swearing, and in the way that they dress. They talk about modesty as a part of walking with God. It's something that we take seriously. And she talked about how I used to think that being provocative was empowering. I bought into the world's thinking about this, but I no longer feel that way. I don't think it's empowering to show myself off. And I know someone else who also struggled with modesty for a long time. And when they came closer to God, they also felt a conviction that God wanted them to be more modest. And that became more and more of a priority. It's interesting to see how, as you really genuinely, honestly try to come closer to God, he asks you to do things. You become clear. You feel that conviction inside of you that he's asking you to be different than you were and to be different than the world. One of the things that triggered my thoughts in this direction, that it's actually cool to be peculiar, that it's a sign of how special we are, was a video my husband sent me on 7 things that C.S. Lewis says we need to quit. 7 things he had to quit when he became a Christian. He had to quit entertainment that didn't elevate and enrich him or draw him closer to God. He became very, very selective about the movies that he watched and the books that he read, and any kind of entertainment he took in a lot less. And he was very careful about what that was. He said he quit spending time with people who weren't drawing him closer to God. He said you need to be very careful that the people that you're hanging out with don't plant doubts in your mind, and that they're enriching your relationship and drawing you closer into relationship with God. He also talks about quitting negativity and criticism and loving instead. Quit magnifying problems and magnify God. Quit being busy and make time for God. Quit trying to please people and try to please God, and quit ignoring and doubting the promptings that God gives you. So these are ways, again, that after he took God into his life and he entered into covenant with God, that he was asked to be different. The last story I'll tell you is about Becket Cook. I have mentioned him on the podcast before, but his story is just so amazing to me. And it's not just his story. I could have gone and there's lots of stories if you want to look for this on YouTube of people who have had this kind of transformation. But he grew up in a Catholic home and he knew from a very young age that he was attracted to men. And in his teenage and college years, he wasn't quite sure what it meant. He just knew that he had same sex attraction and he started going to bars and he started being with men. And eventually he fell in love with a man and he told his family. His parents were very good. They were very gracious about it, very loving. And then he moved to LA. And for a long time, I think 15 years or more, he lived the dream. Like he knew all the famous people. He went to all the big parties. He went to the runway in New York and Paris and knew famous actors and actresses and did all of these things. And then he hits this high point where he's at one of the most fashionable parties in the world and he's sitting there looking around and it just hits him. This isn't it. And 6 months later, he's in a coffee shop back in LA. There's some young people at a table next to him with Bibles. He's never seen Bibles in LA. They start to engage in conversation and he asks them pointedly, "What do you believe about homosexuality?" And they say, "We believe it's wrong. We believe it's a sin. It's not according to God's will." So he appreciated them being honest. They invited him to church. And the next week, he thought about it all week. And the next week, he said, something just got me out of my house and got me to church. And he sat there as the minister preached. He felt the truthfulness of everything that was being said. He had them pray over him. And then he said, God just revealed himself to him in that moment. He wept for half an hour, felt very, very close to God. And then he said this, and I knew in that moment that being a gay man was no longer who I was, and that wasn't going to be a part of my life anymore. I knew that instantly. He gave his life to God completely, became really obsessed with the Bible. He actually ended up going to seminary school eventually. To seminary, he has a very popular podcast and has written a book. Chain to Affection, I think is what it's called. But the point is the conviction behind it. The point is that moment, and there are many stories like this, and I actually know a woman personally. I actually know a few women. One woman that I was thinking about when I was putting this together, who, when she left God, she became involved in homosexual relationships. And when she came back, she felt the same conviction that Eric Metaxas and Becket Cook did, that she needed to live a chaste life and have no sexual relationships outside of marriage and no homosexual relationships anymore. And it's been tough, but she's remained faithful to what she knows God wants her to do. These kinds of stories are unpopular stories. They're the kind of stories people don't want to admit. It's kind of like detransitioners that went and had sex change surgeries and then wanted to change back. And it's because it doesn't fit the popular narrative. It's not cool. It's not what the world does. So I was thinking about the 7 things that C.S. Lewis was putting. And then something hit me today, which drew me back into these stories and this conviction that these people feel when they have a true deep conversion. And it's this idea that God has always had his people be peculiar. This is a central message of the Old Testament. And this is a key element about the Jewish people, the Israelites. They have always been different. They have always been peculiar, special, chosen, called out. And God talks to them over and over again about what this relationship means for them, why we're asked to be peculiar, why you and I, just like the ancient Jews, must be peculiar today. That means we stand out. That means we're different. That means that we don't do what the world does. We look different. We sound different. We have different priorities. We spend our time doing different things because we are in relationship with God and he is showing us the way to behave that is best for us. C.S. Lewis talked about it like an inventor, that God has made the human machine and he knows what makes it run best. And that's what these rules of chastity are. That's what these parameters of being peculiar mean. They mean we want to have God tell us how we ought to behave, what our priorities should be, what we should take into our bodies, how we should behave with other people. We want Him to help us navigate our relationship with Him, with ourselves, and with others in ways that are best in line with the creation that we are. We want the Creator to be in charge. And the ancient Israelites were in this same situation. I really felt probably the closest kinship that I've ever felt in thinking about this concept in this way, thinking about being peculiar. And in fact, I looked up in the 1828 dictionary the word peculiar, and it didn't mean quite what I thought it did. It comes from peculium, the Latin peculiaris, which is one's own property. It means belonging to a person and him only. It means singular, particular, special. It means belonging to a nation or a system or some other thing and not to others. And so when you're peculiar, you belong to God. And I never knew that's what it meant. We think about it as being in an odd, you're different, you're weird. In a biblical sense, it means special and chosen and called. But even from the definition, going back to the ancient Latin, it means that you are owned by God. You belong to Him and Him only. And that was the specialness of the Jewish nation, that they knew they belonged to God and they had a special relationship with Him and they had been called and they were different and they were expected to rise to that call. This is what I found. There are lots of ways, lots of places you can find this, especially in the Old Testament. But here in Deuteronomy 7, God kind of lays this out. And He says, God brought you into this land and He cleared it out. He cleared the nations before you, the Hittites and the Amorites, and He lists all these people. And he says, I've delivered you from them and smitten them. And you won't make any covenants with any of these other nations, and you won't make marriages with them. Thou shalt not give unto his son, nor the daughter shalt thou take unto thy son, for they will turn away thy son from following thee, that they will serve other gods, and the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. This is what you will do with them. You'll destroy their altars and break down their images and cut down their groves. And the groves were these places where they would go out into the woods and engage in immoral acts. And you'll burn down their graven images with fire. So you will encourage them to destroy anything they're worshiping besides the one true God. And He says in verse 6, For you are a holy people unto the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a special people unto Himself above all the people that are upon the face of the earth. He did not set this love upon you or choose you because you were more in number than other people, because you're the fewest of the people. He did it because He loved you and because He would keep the oath which He'd sworn to your fathers that brought you out of the land with a mighty hand and redeemed you out of the house of the bondsman from the hand of the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Know that the Lord thy God, He is God, He is a faithful God, and He keeps covenants and mercies with them that love Him and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations, and He repays them that hate them to His face. So He goes on there, and you will therefore keep the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which I command you this day to do them. So as you read through these passages where it talks about being special or peculiar or called or chosen, you get this picture of a relationship between a people and their God. And this word peculiar meaning that you're owned. And the relationship means that He gets to call the shots because He knows what's best for you, and you will be different. The Israelites were surrounded by all these nations. It's one of the reasons they ended up with kings, even though they started with the rule of the judges, because they wanted to be like the nations around them. And as you go through the Old Testament, you see where they wandered off and married people from other nations. And And it corrupts their faith. It corrupts the relationship that they have with God because they don't stay in the covenant that they have with him by living up to the ways in which they're being different and peculiar. And the coolest thing about this whole idea of being peculiar and choosing to be peculiar and owning it and being proud of it and knowing that when you're in relationship with God, you will be peculiar and he loves that about you and he's proud of that. And that means you belong to him. The coolest part about it is that you, like, God doesn't need you to do it. He doesn't need you and I. He wants us. He loves us, but he doesn't need us. We are the ones that benefit because when we live according to the rules that govern us as creations, then we're happier. Then things function better. Our bodies are healthier. Our minds are healthier. Our souls are healthier. Our relationships are healthier. Our finances benefit all these ways. All these stories of these people who choose to be more chaste, who choose to be more generous, who choose to be um, more more in relationship with God and living those laws that are laid out, those commandments that he's made, they benefit, first of all, from living those laws. So we could do them just because we're going to be better. But then the promise is that God sees us as special and extra blessings flow and divine protection is ours. That's one of the biggest messages of the Old Testament and the New, that we are protected when we are striving to follow God. And that doesn't always mean physical protection, although a lot of times it does. We're protected from famines. We're protected from financial collapse. We're protected from all kinds of breakdowns. We're protected in lots of ways from things that would naturally happen, would be a result of our deviation from the proper way of living. But we're also ultimately, most importantly, protected spiritually. We won't engage in behaviors that will separate us from our God. And as I watched these kind of testimonies, especially of Eric Metaxas and Becket Cook today, as I was getting the information for this podcast, it was so beautiful to listen to these men talk about how that was it for them. The fundamental driving element for their willingness to do whatever they knew they needed to do was they weren't willing to do anything to separate themselves from God in the least. The way that Eric Metaxas said it was so beautiful. I won't give that up, that closeness to God, for anything. I wouldn't do anything to hinder that. That personal relationship with a God who loved me and created the universe for me and died for me was so beautiful and extraordinary. I wouldn't do anything to screw that up. And the moment that Becket Cook had God show up for him, he took baby steps. Both of these men took baby steps. They walked into the church. They said the prayer. They asked God to show up with an honest heart. They were ready for him to show up. And guess what he did? And then they were going to do whatever needed to be done in order to not mess up that relationship, not watch one thing, not enter into any relationship, not engage in any behavior that would not keep them right with God. They were willing and able and enabled through God's grace to be peculiar. That's what we're being called to do. That's what the ancient Israelites do. And the Jews have been hounded and driven out and chastised for centuries for being willing to be peculiar, to look different, to stand out. In many cases, they physically looked very different, but they also ran their money different and their relationships different. And they did not give in when they were staying in covenant, did not give in to the corrupting culture around them. And one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years is that the influence of worldly ideas has been entering more and more our churches. And behaviors that these men and women are feeling convicted that they should not engage in are being given a stamp of approval. And we need to be careful about that. We need to be willing to be very different, to be peculiar, to be special, to be different, to be chosen, to be called, to stand out, and to be proud to represent a God who loves his people enough to give them natural laws and commands that keep them safe in all the ways, keep them protected in all the ways, and keep them close to him so that they can continue to grow to become more like him and return to him. So I hope that there was something in what I said today that was helpful for you or enriching or uplifting. It's an idea that I've never thought about in quite this way that's been very uplifting to me. I feel even more excited to learn more and to honor all the sacrifices and the work that the ancient Israelites do, to honor even the Old Testament and the New in new, profound ways, because I feel such a kinship with them that I don't know if I've ever felt before. That I'm trying to live out something and to stand out and be different in a world that's continuing to embrace things that are not godly. And in trying to remain godly, I'm going to continue to look more and more different. But I choose that because I choose my relationship with a God who loves me and who is always there for me. I hope that you can share this with someone whose life it might enrich, and give a review and share and like and all those kinds of things so that we can continue to grow the podcast if this information has been helpful or enriching to you. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening and for joining me. I will see you next time.